everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Pierce, and the focus is Unapologetic Constitutionalist, come what may. The year is 1857, it's March 3rd, and the Pierces are moving out of the White House the day before Pierce's presidency is coming to an end. They decide to move in with his Secretary of State, William Marcy, and his wife planned to stay for a couple days, but that turned into 3 weeks because Jane Pierce, as so often had been the case, was ill, in fact too ill to travel, so they spent 3 weeks with the Marcys before they got on their way back to New Hampshire, but they didn't get very far. Had to stop in Philadelphia where she needed more bed rest, doctor's care, 6 more weeks. It was May by the time they finally got home to New Hampshire. Well, Jane's health really was going to be their focal point in the immediate aftermath of Pierce's presidency, and they decided to take a trip. In December of that same year, they decided to head to Europe, where they landed at Madeira, just off the coast of Morocco, where they spent 6 months. 6 really good months as far as Jane Pierce was concerned. She did remarkably well from a health standpoint, some of the best health she had had in years. The warm climate was good, the worry-free atmosphere, no politics. She had her husband to herself. Did a world of good. In June of 1858, they decided to continue the trip, heading over to the continent, touring Western Europe, many different countries, but it was unlike tours of other former presidents, Martin Van Buren and Millard Fillmore, for example, who were feted by royals and government officials and fancy dinners and those kinds of events. That was not what the Pierces were looking for. They wanted to see Europe, but they wanted a leisurely time, off the beaten path, time to themselves, and that's mostly what they got, and it did them a world of good. They finished up in Italy, where they had a chance to reconnect with Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife, Hawthorne being Pierce's lifelong friend from his college days, the great American novelist who had also served Pierce in Europe as the consul to Liverpool during Pierce's term. It stayed in Europe, had an opportunity to reconnect with the Pierces in Italy in 1859. Well, that was the year that Pierce and his wife returned to the United States, and they came back in very difficult times. The challenges of the 1850s between North and South over slavery and its expansion, it dated to the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, all things that Franklin Pierce knew all too well. Things were not getting better. In fact, they were getting worse. And the big concern now is what happens if the country elects a Republican in the next year's election in 1860? Pierce had long predicted that if a Republican, this new party in the North that had part of its core belief was absolutely no more expansion of slavery beyond where it already existed, he thought that would be the last straw for the South, and many states would opt to leave the Union. This was his big concern, and he thought, what way to stop this? Well, the Democrats are going to have to align around a single candidate that the nation can support to try to keep the nation together. This was going to be hard to do because even the Democrats were now fracturing along sectional lines with different ideological perspectives. So when they got together in Charleston, South Carolina for the Democratic Convention in 1860, they spent 10 days trying to pick a nominee that they could rally around, and they failed. They couldn't do it. They eventually broke up. They agreed to come back, try one more time. They were going to meet in Baltimore the following month to see if they could unify around a single candidate, and in fact, they could not. Eventually, the convention splintered, and they ended up with 2 different factions nominating 2 different candidates. You had Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the senator, who was the representative of the popular sovereignty wing of the party, as one of those nominees. And then you had John Breckinridge, the sitting vice president, originally from Kentucky. He represented the core interests of the South. Both of them would be nominated, going up against the Republican. William Seward was actually kind of in the lead in a lot of people's mind heading into the Republican National Convention of 1860, but it took 3 ballots to go in a different direction. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois getting the nomination. So now you've got Lincoln, you've got Douglas, you've got Breckinridge. If the Democrats don't align, this could hand the election to the Republicans, and that is what happened. Lincoln, who got no votes from the South, still largely a Northern candidate, wins a majority in the Electoral College. He gets less than 40% of the popular vote, the lowest of anyone in American history, but the Democrats weren't winning states because they were too divided, and that put Lincoln over the top with a majority in the Electoral College. He's now president-elect, and states, sure enough, begin to secede. Franklin Pierce is distraught over this, and he's looking to somebody to blame, and that's easy in his mind. The blame goes to the North. According to Pierce, the North had been the first wrongdoers, and he had never been able to see how a successful appeal could be made to the South without first placing the North right. People were interested in Pierce's opinion. In fact, one of those Southern conventions that was about to vote on secession in Alabama had invited him to come speak to them. Now, he had to turn down that appointment, but he did send a letter, and it was a supportive letter. According to Pierce, how can I urge the men of the South to take a view I should not take if I were there? A view which I do not take as a Northern man with all I have at stake here. If we cannot live together in peace, then in peace and on just terms, let us separate. Interesting words coming from a former president of the United States. Now, Pierce thought maybe all the former presidents might be able to do something, a last-minute effort to try to avert war and preserve the Union. So he sent out some letters to the former presidents to see if they would be willing to come together and try to come up with some kind of compromise that might preserve the Union and avoid the war. Didn't go anywhere. Martin Van Buren, the dean of the former presidents, who would be himself dead within about a year, he wrote back saying he just didn't think there was anything that good could come of this. It was kind of too late, and so he declined to participate, and the idea ultimately was for naught. Well, now, Abraham Lincoln, the new president, sworn in March 4th of 1861, did not agree with Pierce's idea of letting the South go in peace. Secession was illegal. It was unconstitutional in his mind. He's now the president. He had a responsibility to uphold the Constitution, keep the Union intact, even if it meant military force. And sure enough, about a month into his term in office, the Confederates fired on the federal fort in Charleston, South Carolina's harbor, Fort Sumter. Sumter fell, and Lincoln declared the South in rebellion. He called out for volunteers from the North to suppress that rebellion. Former presidents took different stands on this particular topic. Again, Martin Van Buren wouldn't last much longer, but how about John Tyler? John Tyler became a secessionist. He was aligned with his state of Virginia. He believed that the North was at fault, that they had tried to usurp their authority and take away the rights of the South that they didn't have to stand for. If the compact that originally brought them together had been violated by the North, the South had every right to leave. He supported secession and, in fact, was elected to the Confederate Congress. He would have served in that Congress if he hadn't died a month before he was going to take his seat. You've got then maybe a Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore had signed the Fugitive Slave Law into law. He had some sympathies for the South in trying to come up with a national solution, but he drew the line at secession. He completely supported the war effort. In fact, rallied folks in the western New York area in his hometown of Buffalo to support Lincoln and the war effort. How about James Buchanan, who had just left the White House? Well, Buchanan stayed pretty quiet after the war. He went home to Pennsylvania to write a book basically saying, don't blame me. Not my fault, and here's all the reasons why. That's sort of where the headspace was for James Buchanan. What about Franklin Pierce? Well, Pierce had already come out and said that he's blaming the North for all this, and he actually saved some of the most fiery rhetoric of his entire career for the Civil War, directed almost exclusively at President Abraham Lincoln. He decried not only the war, but the manner in which the commander-in-chief was prosecuting it, that he believed to be unconstitutional. Examples: August 1862, Lincoln used his power as commander-in-chief to declare martial law. According to Pierce, this was unauthorized, unconstitutional. Pierce wrote in a letter to John George, "Is not this the worst form of despotism? Martial law declared throughout the land with the additional appendage of a band of prejudiced, passionate, irresponsible abolition office holders constituted as a special corps of accusers? Let there be no more talk of sovereign states, of constitutional rights, of trial by jury, of legal protection for persons and property." As far as Pierce was concerned, Lincoln had taken the Constitution and ripped it apart. Well, how about the next act? Just a few months later, Lincoln established his Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, which used his power as commander-in-chief to free all the slaves in the states that were currently in rebellion. Franklin Pierce's response to that? Unconstitutional. According to Pierce, the last proclamation of the president caps the climax of folly and wickedness. What will the world say of a proclamation emanating from the President of the United States, not only in defiance of the fundamental law of the country, for the upholding of which he ought to have been willing to shed his own blood, but in defiance of all law, human and divine? Franklin Pierce went on, time and again, attacking President Lincoln for his unconstitutional actions. Of course, Lincoln wasn't paying any attention to this, nor practically anybody else, as Lincoln was continuing to do what in his mind was his constitutional responsibility, to save the Union. In fact, in his mind, if he had to break the Constitution to save it, to save the Union, then that was all part of the job of being the president in a time of rebellion. As far as Franklin Pierce was concerned, he would never see it that way. He wrote a letter to Jane with nothing to apologize for. He said, "I will never justify, sustain, or in any way or to any extent uphold the cruel, heartless, aimless, unnecessary war. Madness and imbecility are in the ascendant. I shall not succumb to them, come what may. I have no opinions to retract, no line of action to change." Again, not many people were listening to Franklin Pierce while he was making this constitutional argument, but it is an interesting question for strict constructionists, for constitutionalists, on the opinions expressed by Franklin Pierce during this period. As far as the health of the Pierces, well, Jane was the first to succumb to all those years of illnesses. It was during the war, December 2nd, 1863. She passed, and very shortly thereafter, Pierce's close friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne, also died of a long-term disease. So two of his closest longtime colleagues' relationships were now past, and he was very much on his own because all three of his children, of course, had passed very, very early. He had his own health scare in 1865. It prompted him to actually become baptized and join the church, which Jane certainly would have been proud of, but he wasn't helping himself. He was drinking again. He was starting to deteriorate, but he would outlive Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, assassinated April of 1865, just after the war ended. All the homes in Concord, New Hampshire, just about all of them, raised the American flag to honor the fallen president, but not Franklin Pierce. And the locals weren't happy. They converged on Pierce's home and demanded him to come out and give an explanation. And he again was unapologetic. According to Pierce, "If the period which I have served our state and country in various situations, commencing more than 35 years ago, has left the question of my devotion to the flag, the Constitution of the Union, in doubt, it is too late now to resume it by any such exhibition as the inquiry suggests." In other words, he wasn't going to explain himself. He had a record to follow. And as far as what he felt about Abraham Lincoln, he thought he had violated the Constitution, and he was not mourning him in the way that the community wanted. But the community listened to Pierce. It dissipated. It let him go about his business. In contrast, Pierce was strongly supportive of his old friend Jefferson Davis, who had served in his cabinet as Secretary of War and had gone on to become the president of the Confederacy. He, of course, had been arrested, was being held in some pretty lousy situation in prison in the South, and Pierce came to his aid. In fact, he actually even made a trip to go and give his support to Davis to try to get him better living conditions, which he eventually got. Davis was eventually never tried. He was freed when the final pardons came from President Andrew Johnson. But you can see where Pierce stood. Not a lot of support for Lincoln, even in death. He had more support for his friend Jefferson Davis. Well, Pierce spent much of his last year off a little Boar's Head in Northampton, New Hampshire, not doing well, drinking again, losing weight. Finally, in September 1869, he was under 100 pounds. His doctor said there wasn't much they could do for him, and he died about a month later, October 8th, 1869, just shy of his 65th birthday. Franklin Pierce, more than anything else, wanted to be like his father. Military glory, political ascendancy, service to his community. And he got his chances, all of the above. He was a congressman, a senator, a brigadier general in the Mexican War, president of the United States. Many of these, though, he stumbled. He stumbled badly. In the war, he physically stumbled, and we covered that in a previous episode. As president, he also stumbled. He was out of touch with his country that was fracturing, and he was trying to hold on to that strict constructionist constitutional perspective and basically hoping that everyone could just get along, but this was no longer enough. The path to national fracture ran right through the presidency of Franklin Pierce, and if anything, his unwavering ideological commitment to the Constitution and the principles associated with the strict constructionist accelerated the break that eventually fractured when Abraham Lincoln became president. That is Franklin Pierce, unapologetic constitutionalist, come what may, from the life of Franklin Pierce. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. and this is Presidential Chronicles.